So hi everybody, this is customizing reports in QuickBooks Online. We're going to call this one part 1, fundamentals, because 1 hour is just not enough to cover all the intricacies and potential things you can do with reporting inside QuickBooks Online. My name is Hector Garcia. I'm a CPA. I practice out of Miami, Florida. There's my email if you need to contact me directly for whatever reason. And we'd like to thank ADP for sponsoring today's episode and for supporting QuickBooks related topic, which is very dear to my heart. So thank you, ADP, for that. If you weren't able to download the slides via the CPA Academy portal, we did put a link to downloading the slides in the chat box, and there's also a fixed link on the presentation itself where you can download the PDF version of the slides as well. So let's get right to it. If you, for whatever reason, I didn't cover something that you were expecting from me to cover, just write down my email, have that information handy, and then maybe at the end of the webinar or after, I might be able to help you directly if you contact me. As I mentioned, I run my own accounting and QuickBooks consulting technology practice out of Miami, Florida. I'm also a member of the QuickBooks Intuit reseller team. Our firm resells QuickBooks as well. So, table of contents for today. We'll spend 5 minutes talking about reporting capabilities across all versions, just sort of a quick introduction so you can have an idea of, based on what version of QuickBooks you have, what are the things that you are most likely to see or not to see when it comes to reports. Then we'll spend about 10 minutes talking about customizing standard reports, some of the fundamental tools available to customizing standard reports. We'll do a couple of examples for customization. We'll talk about source and distribution basics, which if you're going to build a report from scratch, you need to know what does QuickBooks mean by source and what do they mean by distribution. And sometimes distribution is called split. We'll get into that. We'll spend about 10 minutes there. Then we'll talk about building reports from scratch. What does that process look like? We'll leave about 5 minutes for Q&A and 5 to 10 minutes to ADP so they can do their quick presentation on Accountant Connect, which is for accounting professionals pretty much the best tool out there in the payroll world, in my opinion. Okay, sorry about that. So I guess our slides weren't moving, so I just covered the table of contents slide only. So what we will not be covering today's session, and just to kind of set the expectation, because I know a lot of people are going to have questions in the chat box, we're not going to be covering management reports and not going to be covering automating reports, anything with in-depth class and location tracking, payroll, inventory, cash flow, industry benchmarks, performance center or charts, which are available in QuickBooks Online Advanced, and the Fathom HQ app, which are only available in QuickBooks Online. We will save that to a future potential part 2 or part 3 if this session is popular enough to get multiple parts per se. So these are the stuff that we're not going to be covered. We're going to be focusing on the stuff in the table of contents that we just discussed. So let's talk about the capabilities by version. And there's a link here that you can click on right there on the slides that will take you to a knowledge base article with a quick chart that kind of explains the difference of what type of reports are available in Simple Start, Essentials, and Plus. They haven't added the Advanced tab yet because they're sort of still kind of working through what extra reports you're expecting to see from the Advanced edition. But if you're working with QuickBooks Online Advanced, all the reports that are in Plus will be available there. So make sure to check out that link that's on that slide, because that will give you report by report what's available on each version. From a high level, when it comes to QuickBooks Online Simple Start, you are going to have access to all the basic financial reports, but you're going to have really limited customization. And the one that really, really stands out, that most accountants get a little bit frustrated when they're working with clients on Simple Start, is not being able to have that comparative column, which we'll cover in today's session. Now, once you get to Essentials, you're going to have access to that comparative column. You're going to have about 30 additional reports that are available, including timesheet and accounts payable reports, just because those two features are not available in Simple Start. So anything having to do with bills like accounts payable or timesheet, that's just not going to be available. In Simple Start, you're going to need Essentials at least to do that. Once you get into Plus, you're going to have additional reports related to inventory, because only with QuickBooks Online Plus you can do inventory. Anything with job costing, like project-based reports, class and location related reports. For that, you're going to need Plus or Advanced. And then if you want to get into using the Fathom HQ app, which is a third-party app that Intuit partnered with to create additional really good-looking reports, you're going to have to work with QuickBooks Online Advanced. The new Performance Center with customizable charts, which we'll not be covering in today's session. That's only available in the Advanced Edition. You can now export your reports to Google Sheets on top of Excel. The Excel feature is actually available across all versions. But if you want to export to Google Sheets, you're going to have to be in the Advanced Edition. And then also, if you're working with the new custom fields feature and you want the reports based on those custom fields, you're going to be having to work on the Advanced Edition. So it's really important that you know and are aware what version you're working in before you start working with reports, because it might be frustrating for you to try to build a report and then realize that the version you're in doesn't have that capability. Okay, so whenever you're going to pull a report, you're going to have a header on top of the report that contains all the moving parts, all the buttons, all the options that you can do. In the next two slides that are here, this is basically just a quick cheat sheet that you can print, have it available. There's an explanation of what each of those fields do, and we're going to go through all of them right when we go into the demo. So just kind of just have those slides handy for you to have them as a cheat sheet when you're building your own report. So let's go into QuickBooks Online and do a couple of examples of customizing the report. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the Reports section, on the Reports button on the left-hand side of the screen, and then click on Reports. That's going to take me into the Reports Center. Now, a quick tip, if you hit Control plus and Control minus on your keyboard, you can quickly zoom in and zoom out, and you might see me doing that through the presentation based on the report that we're seeing. In some cases, I want to see larger font or smaller font based on how much information I want to see on the screen. And I'm going to start with the most basic report, which is the profit and loss. You should see it on the favorite section. If you don't happen to have it in your favorite section, you can go down to business overview and you would see profit and loss on the second column. You can also find the standard report by searching it in the find the report search box. I'll just type there the word profit, and then you can see all the profit and loss related reports that are available. This report search also works on the magnifying glass on the top right of the screen. So you can also type there profit and loss and pull up the report. So there's obviously multiple ways to get to the profit and loss. Now, one thing I'll add here is one thing I strongly recommend. If you find yourself often pulling up a profit and loss report and you think it's way too many clicks to get there, the best thing you can do is add it into your bookmarks. So I'm using Google Chrome. So I'm going to click on the three little dots here on the top right, which is sort of the options tab. And then I'm going to click on bookmarks and then click on where it says show bookmarks bar. By doing that, I will enable bookmarks. And then what I can do is I can, up here in the top in my bookmarks, I can create any bookmarks I want on the reports that I'm seeing. So simply, I just pull the report that I want. Let's say, for example, I want to do this fiscal year to date. Let's say this is the report that I want to have kind of saved in my bookmarks. Click on Run Report. And then what I do is I click on the URL where the URL is. And you're going to see right left to the URL a little tiny lock button there, or an icon, and all I have to do is click on that and drag it anywhere into my bookmarks bar. So I'm going to put it there as number 1, and then I'll right click on it and click on edit and call it P&L. So by doing this, essentially I don't have to click through anywhere in QuickBooks. I could be anywhere in any screen in QuickBooks, and I simply just click on that P&L bookmark button that's there, and it'll take me straight to it. You can also access the bookmarks bar by clicking bookmarks on the top right of the screen. All the way on the top of the screen. And then you will see all your bookmarks, including that P&L that I created. You could also build a folder and have a whole slew of bookmarks that you can create into that folder, and you can break them down by customer even, if that happens to be the case. So there we go. So we got our P&L up. So there's two areas that you want to pay attention to for customization. The first one is this light blue shaded area that contains all these different drop-down menu. The first one is for you to pick a predetermined date range, or for you to manually choose the date range that you want. Keep in mind that the minute you change manually something in the date range box, it will change it to custom. And this is an important distinction to make, because if you make a custom report and then you save it, whenever you come back and pull it, you're going to get that same exact date range. If you don't have custom selected here, and you have one of the options here in the drop-down menu, like this year to last month, if you save this report and pull it later, this report will be dynamic. So depending on the month that you're in, this report will show you the last month or the proper last month. So it's really important to make the distinction. The minute that you make any change, it'll change over to custom. And then once you see custom here, that will always be the report that comes out. So let's go ahead and do this fiscal year to last month, and then click on run report, and there we're seeing the report. Now at this point, one of the common questions I get, especially from accountants, is, Hector, this is actually the default report that I want to see at all times. How to get QuickBooks to default to this option instead of defaulting to whatever the default is, which is usually this month or last month. I forget what the default is. So if you want to change the overall default, you're going to click on Accountant Tools, and this only works for accountants, by the way. So if you're not logged in as an accountant, you're not going to have this option. And then we're going to click on where it says Report Options. So once I click on Report Options, here it tells me what is the default report that's going to come out every single time I run a report from scratch. So I'm going to click here, this fiscal year to date, for example, or whatever option I have here. And then once I change it here, then when I go and run a new report, that will be the default report that comes out. So if you go into that account, into the report options in Accountant Tools, that's where you can modify what is the default report that will show up when you run a report from scratch. Then we have columns by. This is a really, really powerful tool. This is probably the most common place, other than changing the date, of course, that people go into to modify a report. So for example, if I'm looking at a report this year to date or this year to last month, let's say I want to break down this report by month. So what I do is I click on Display Columns By, and I change that from total only, which means only one column, change that to months. And then I have to click on Run Report in order to activate this option. And once I click on Run Report, you're going to see that my report is now broken down by month. Okay. And after you do a breakdown by month, you might want to think about sorting, right? Especially because I'm seeing so much information on the screen, and it potentially tends to be a little bit confusing. So my preference is to sort it by descending order. In other words, I want the biggest number on the top, the smallest bottom on the bottom, and with that smallest number in the bottom and the biggest on the top, you essentially highlight the most important, the most significant accounts. So I'm going to click here on Total Descending Order, and then you see how QuickBooks will resort everything by amount. And the way it resorts by amount is it actually focuses on the total. So the total, whatever the total amount is on this column, will be the sorting. Because you will notice that in some specific months, it won't seem to be sorted. Like January, I'm not seeing the biggest number in the top. In March, I am, but just understand that overall, that's driven by that total amount. Now I'm going to go ahead and click on the collapse left navigation bar button, or what they call the hamburger icon, the three little lines to the left of the company name, just so I can get a little bit more real estate, and I'll zoom in on the report so we can see a little bit better. I'm going to go ahead and click on refresh, and we're going to try a couple other things. So the other thing we can do is on the customization, instead of months, I'm going to do quarters so we can see a little bit less of the columns, and then click on run report. And a couple of things to point out here is when you run a report and there are columns that would have zeros, QuickBooks by default or based on your settings, it's showing blanks. So you can actually customize that by clicking on the customize button on the right hand side, and then in here you can choose whether or not you want to see the zero amount. So I'm going to go ahead and click on accept zero amounts and then click on run report. And then QuickBooks will now fill in the zero amount. So that's really your option, right? So if you wanna fill the zero amounts, if you wanna just have a blank there, that's really up to you. So that's the columns and the sorting, which I personally think is probably the two most important things to look at. The other thing that you want to look at here is sub account. So for example, as I scroll down, notice I have a payroll expenses account with sub accounts, I think, and then I have payroll taxes with a sub account. So at any point in time that you don't care to want to see those sub accounts and you don't manually want to go into each one and click on the little triangle to hide the sub accounts, you will click on the collapse button. Once you click on collapse, all the sub accounts will disappear. And note also your ability to expand and collapse the specific account on the fly will also disappear. So if I click on expand, all the accounts are expanded, but while we are on expanded mode, I can still manually click on that little triangle to the left of payroll expenses and to the left of payroll taxes, for example, and manually collapse those sub accounts. So if you click on collapse, remember that they're not just going to be collapsed, you're also not going to be able to open and close them on demand. So that's just a really important concept there. Now, the other important concept here is, what about accounts in my chart of accounts that have not been used? So right now, by default, the QuickBooks reporting system is going to omit any accounts in my chart of accounts that have not been used. In other words, you're not going to see any accounts with zeros across the board per se. So in order to include that, if you want to, we will select this active option. And I'm going to illustrate that by showing maybe just 1 month where maybe not all the accounts have been used. At this point, it looks like all the accounts have been used. So I'm just going to click here on, let's do last month. So then we'll do last month and click on run. And then here where it says rows, I'm going to click on all and then click on run. And then let me show you what happens when I do that. So when I run a report, in this case, profit and loss for July, you have all these accounts here that have zeros. They are part of my chart of accounts. They are part of my revenue accounts or my income accounts. And then I have my expense accounts. I also have a whole bunch that are also part of my chart of accounts, but they were not used in that particular month. So if you need to include the accounts that haven't been used, you have to click on this all option. If I click on non-zero in this case and I click on run report, QuickBooks will make sure that none of the transactions that have zero values on it, or not the transactions I meant, the accounts that have zero values on it will show up. Now the tricky one is this one called active, which is the default one. Now active will mean that if the account has been used, even if it renders a zero at the end, the zero will still show up. So I'm going to show you how that works. I'm going to click on run report and then we'll go down for a second, and then I'm going to add a expense for one of these accounts, a zero value. I'm going to show you how that will work. So let me go ahead and go to new transaction. I'm going to go to expense and I'm going to pick, let me just pick any vendor here at random. And then we'll pick here, let's pick an account that might not be used. Let's just assume is this one. Let's do uncategorized expense. That'll probably be better. So let's do uncategorized expense. And I'm going to make this $0. So in other words, the total amount that this transaction will render will be 0. And it would show up on the report if I choose to leave active on. So let's go back and check out what that report looks like. Let's just do last month in this case. So let's do last month and total only and click on run. And then see, by default, uncategorized expense is showing at 0. Why? It's because I have at least one transaction that is there. It's active, even though it renders a 0. So if you want to get rid of that 0, basically you would click here and click on non-zero and then click on run report. And then even though there's an active transaction, an active line there, it will still hide the 0. So that's actually a really important piece of it. Is it possible to change the font size on a report? So the answer is no. You cannot change the font size on a report, but what you can do is you can zoom in and zoom out on your screen by clicking Control plus and Control minus. And then when you go print it, you can change the overall percentage size of your print, but you cannot change the individual font size on the report. So some of the additional things that we talk about typically on customizing reports, and we alluded to at the beginning, is comparative periods. So I'm going to go ahead and run my profit and loss report by last month, and then click on Run Report. And then what I want to do is I want to compare next to July. I want to compare what June looked like. So I'm going to go ahead and display columns. I'm going to click on Total Only, and then where it says Compare Another Period, I'm going to select Previous Period, and then I'm going to select a dollar change. So once I click on Do that and click on Run Report, I can actually compare July and June next to each other with a dollar change, right? So if July increase, you're going to see a positive change. If July decrease, you're going to see a negative change. In many cases, when we do comparatives, instead of doing a dollar change, we'll do a percentage change. And then if you do a percentage change, it's the same effect, but now you're going to see a percentage number next to it instead of a dollar change. You actually have the option to do both, which is pretty cool. You can do both dollar and percentage change. In my opinion, once you get to that, the report becomes kind of confusing and it starts losing a little bit of power. So in my experience, the best thing you can do as a report creator is create a report that's actually going to be used, a report that the end user actually understands and can take action with. If you don't do that, then the whole exercise of getting the report ready, it's kind of useless, right? So that's just a really important thing. Now, the other one that's worth comparing is previous year. Now, what previous year will do is it will compare July of 2019 versus July of 2020. So I'll compare the same period in my report versus the same period in the previous report. And this will work with any period you choose. So if I choose, let's say, for example, I'm going to do 2/15/2020 through April 26, 2020. And I'm picking this date range for a very specific reason. Only the PPP nerds out there know what I'm talking about. But when I click on Run Report and I do a comparative with it, you notice once you look at the actual date range that it's actually comparing the same exact date range, comparing year over year. So that's the difference between previous period and previous year. That's just a really important one to keep in mind. Now, anytime you have a custom date range and you want to compare a previous period, QuickBooks will give you the additional question, which is, hey, since you picked a random date range, do you want to customize also what that period could be? So notice in this particular case, when I do previous period, is basically taking the same amount of days backwards retroactively through the period. So that's a really cool thing that you can do, is that you can actually compare a completely different time range in period versus the current period when you're dealing with comparative periods. So anytime you're dealing with comparative periods, you actually can customize what the other comparative period looks like. Now, in my experience, that's not used very commonly, but it's just really important to know that it's there. The other really important comparison column to use is percentage of income. So if I'm doing this year to last month, for example, and then click on Run, what I might want to show is which of these items have the most impact to my bottom line, or the most impact compared to sales. So what I can do in this case is I can do a comparative period and choose percentage of income. So when I click percentage of income and then click on Run, you're going to notice that every single line is going to have a percentage of income next to it. So you will know that your office expenses in this case are 6.37% of your gross income, and your cost of goods sold is 1.42% of your gross income, etc., etc. So that percentage of gross income is very commonly used. There's a couple of quirky ones here, like percentage of row and percentage of column. For example, if I do percentage of column in this case and click on Run, what this will do now is it will compare it against my net income, right? So then basically this will tell you what percentage of your net income these numbers are instead of showing you the percentage of sales. And the reason for that is because it's going to take the very last number in the column and make that the comparative number. You also have percentage of expenses, which again, I don't use it very commonly, but it's a really interesting one to look at, especially if you're maybe just focused on expenses. That would be a really neat one to look at. And you have percentage of row if you're looking numbers across the board. Let me show you how percentage of row will work. This is actually not very commonly used, but in many cases, if you know how to use it right, it would be really, really interesting to use. So I'm going to do percentage of row, and then what I'm also going to do is do this by quarter, okay? Actually, let's do it by month because we got about 7 months in. So when I do percentage of row by month, and I'm going to go ahead and collapse my revenue column, what I'm essentially able to see is in the last 7 months, right? In my last 7 months, what has each of the month represented to my total sales for the last year. So you see that January represented 15% of it, right? And then we have February was 3%, March was 58.45%, and so forth. So again, this is going to be based on your use case, based on your needs. You would see whether or not this would be a useful thing to do. Now let's go over and go into the balance sheet and look at just similar report customizations for balance sheet. And in my opinion, anytime you run a balance sheet, you always want to have the comparative period next to it, especially if you're going to close, you're going to show current year compared to the closing of the previous year. So I'm going to go ahead and click on where it says, let's say this fiscal year to last month, and then select period. I'm going to be previous period dollar change, and I click on run. So this is typically actually, I'm sorry, for balance sheet, we don't do previous period, we do previous year dollar change. And the reason for that is because you want to compare, in this case, January through July 31st, and then the closing of the previous year. Let me just make sure this thing is working correctly on the comparative. So we'll do previous period dollar change, and let's just make sure that this is using the correct comparative period. Let me try this again. Previous period dollar change, run report, exactly like this. So this is what you want. You want to see everything up to the period that you're measuring now, and then the comparative next to it should be the previous year. Now, unfortunately, on this sample file, I don't have anything under assets. I do have something under liabilities and equity, so we can see the comparative. So both tools are available in P&L and balance sheet. The active rows, the number of columns, the comparative periods. With the balance sheet, one of the common things you want to do is maybe compare by quarters and click on run report, and then you get to see the change in your balance sheet quarter over quarter. So you can do that analysis in both ways. So those are the typical things that we look at when comparing or doing comparisons and using the basic tools in there. Now, the one feature that was actually released a couple of months ago that is worth mentioning is the edit titles feature. So editing titles actually allows you to change the high level title of every one of your reports. So for example, I'm going to go ahead and go back into a profit and loss and show you how something like that will work. And again, the default settings in QuickBooks are actually different. I've actually edited the titles in the screen. I'm going to click on edit titles, and then I'm going to delete everything that I have modified in there. And this is the default look, right? So by default, your income or your sales has the word income in it, and your cost of goods sold has the word cost of goods sold, and your expenses has the word expenses. Those are the titles that traditionally QuickBooks has used. I'm going to collapse them all for a second just so we can see all the high level titles. So any of these high level titles can actually be edited by clicking on this edit titles button. So I'm going to click on edit titles, and instead of income, I'm going to call this sales. And instead of cost of goods sold, I'm going to call this cost of sales. And instead of expenses, I'm going to call this operating expenses. And then instead of other income, we're going to call this extraordinary income. You spell that correctly. And then for other expenses, we'll call it extraordinary expenses. And other net income, we'll leave that, and then we'll click on save. So let's see what that will look like if I change those titles. So I click on run report again, and here we go. So we got our main category sales, second main category cost to sales, operating expenses, extraordinary income, extraordinary expenses. So that's pretty self-explanatory if you want to change those titles. If you don't like the changes you made, all you have to do is come here and delete each of the ones that you changed, which will be a little bit darker than the other ones. Click on save, and QuickBooks will go back and resort to the original titles that you have. Let's go ahead and do a print for this report. So when I try to print this report, and I don't know if it's going to happen now, sometimes you will see the report not fit on the page correctly. If that ever happens, what you want to do is you want to make sure that your orientation is correct, your landscape or your portrait needs to be correct, and make sure that matches your default print settings. And then once you click on print, right, what you want to do is you want to click on more settings, and then you can scale your paper size. So you're going to have default, which sometimes will mess up your size, fit into printable area, fit to paper, or custom. So if you ever find yourself printing a report and the report cutting off, you want to do is you want to mess with these scale settings and make sure that you have either fit to printable area turned on or fit to paper turned on in order for basically Google Chrome or your browser to accommodate the report. Now, if you still have an issue printing a report and it cutting off, what you can do is you can save it as a PDF, and then you can open the PDF by itself and then try to print the PDF by itself. So in some cases, this happened to me where QuickBooks is just printing the reports weird. I just save it as a PDF, open the PDF separately, and print it. So just some quick troubleshooting techniques if your printing is not coming off correctly. Okay. All right. Another question I have is right here. Is there a rolling 12-month report in QuickBooks? So the answer is no. There isn't a rolling 12-month report in QuickBooks, but you can create your own rolling 12-month report on QuickBooks. So let's assume for a second that I want to run a report for the last 12 months up to July 31st. So in this case, there's no rolling 12 months here or previous 12 months here. So I would click on custom, and then on the to date, I would put 7/31/2020. And then on the from, in this case, I would do August 1st, 2019. So I manually chose my 12-month period. And then when I go to total columns by, I'll click on months and then run report. And this will give you my rolling 12 months. So there isn't a one button you could press for a rolling 12 months, but you can easily customize QuickBooks to do a rolling 12 months. Okay, so let's go through the slides here to see if we missed anything from the slides. I don't think we did. Let's talk about location and class tracking, which is one of my favorite features inside QuickBooks. I'm going to go back and run a report for this year to last month. And instead of columns by month, I'm going to do columns by locations and then click on run. Now, I'm going to give you some background on this first, just in case locations and classes is a new concept for you. The way running a report by class or by location, in this case we picked location, it will require you to work in QuickBooks Online Plus or QuickBooks Online Advanced, because Simple Start and Essentials doesn't have locations. And it also requires you that every single transaction has a location or a class assigned to it. So when I ran my profit and loss by location, in this case, notice that there's a third column called not specified, and that's for every transaction that doesn't have a location associated with it. So I can just simply click on any of those numbers inside non-specified. This will give me now a detailed report that shows me every single transaction that's affecting that line. And then I can pick any of these invoices, click on them, and then I can change the location. So let's say this one was sold out of the Miami office. As you can tell up here, we have a drop-down menu for all our available locations. Okay, and then notice here was a state I have a custom field for state, which is another option for tracking sales by state. Now, this is only going to work. The state column will only work if you're working with QuickBooks Online Advanced, where you can create your own drop-down custom field. Same thing as sales rep. QuickBooks doesn't have a default sales rep. These are two examples of custom fields using QuickBooks Online Advanced. We're not going to get into it in this because that would be like for a part 2 or a part 3. Custom fields are a bit more complex in our world. We're going to be focusing on locations, which is a default option in QuickBooks Online Plus. And then we're going to go ahead and click on save. And then I'll pick another invoice and change the location so you can see exactly how that functions. Let me pick this big one here and make it West Palm Beach office, and then click on save and close. So I'm going to go back to my profit and loss by location, and you notice how now I can actually get an individual P&L for everything that's related to my Miami office, an individual P&L for everything related to my West Palm Beach office, which also requires that every single expenditure is also linked to that class or linked to that location. So that's how it will work with classes and locations. Same thing if you're using classes, and just think of classes and locations as two type of dimensions you can add in addition to the stuff that's already defaulted, like customer name or account. Now, the difference between class and locations is that you can only have one location per transaction, whereas with classes, you can have multiple classes per transaction. And you can enable both features, classes and locations. You have to think about which of the transactions or which if you're going to have transactions that will essentially have multiple dimensions measured in a single transaction, then you would use classes. And just one way to illustrate that is, for example, you will notice that the class column is individually inside each line item in an invoice. So you can essentially have two line items, let's say two completely line items that hit two different classes. As you can see, one line is hitting my labor class, the other one is hitting my overhead class, and you pick these things, right? So if you can call your classes whatever you want, but the location is only one column and it's not per line item. So that's the best way to think of locations and classes as two different things. At the end of the day, you can use them as you wish. You can use them for whatever you want. That's just the limitation, right? Locations, only one per transaction. Custom fields, only one per transaction. Classes could be multiple per transaction. Okay, so that's one thing I wanted to cover just because one of the most underutilized features in the QuickBooks Online world. Now, I want to move on to a different topic, and this is more of a conceptual topic, which is the topic of a source versus destination. Sometimes the word destination, people use the word split or the word distribution. And basically just think that every transaction in QuickBooks is going to have a source account and it's going to have a detail or destination distribution account. And this will be a quick cheat sheet for you to kind of fundamentally go back and understand how this works. And once I do some custom reports, it will make a lot more sense. But to further into this concept, think of a check, for example. When you write a check, you're going to have your payee, you're going to have the bank account that you paid from. That information belongs to the source, right? Because that's where the money is coming from and where the money is going to, let's call that. But then we have our distribution lines, which are the details inside the transaction. So the expense categories, the individual items that we're buying and selling, those would be those distributions, those detail, those destination lines. And the reason why you need to know this is because when you're running custom reports in QuickBooks, it will ask you what account would you like to filter by. And in some cases, it will ask you for a distribution account or a split account, which would be different than a source account. So for example, if you wanted to find out all the checks that you've written from a specific bank account, then what you need is the source account. You need to know which bank account we're going to use in our filters. But if you want to know all the checks that you've paid to a specific expense category, the source account is not important. What's important is the distribution account. So in that example of that check, when you run a transaction journal where you can see the guts, the debits and the credits of that journal, the first line will always have the source account, and then second line, and if you have multiple lines, those will all have detail account. So notice here on the slide where under the word account, it says Chase. That's the source account. That's my bank account. But then under the word account for our second and third line, it's expense categories, right? Equipment cost, cost of goods sold, cost, etc. So when you're running a report, you need to know, am I running a detailed report with distribution accounts, or am I running a source account? And the reason why this is important, because, and this happens to, I bet you, 99% of you, you run a report and then under account, it says split. And then it drives you crazy because you're like, split doesn't mean anything. I wish you told me what is the expense account that I'm using. I don't want to see the word split. Well, the reason why that is happening is because your report, it's in essence a source report, not a distribution report. And that report will never show you the details on the split account if you have more than one line. So then you have to go back and find a report that's a distribution report in nature. All right. I know that's confusing potentially, but let's do a quick example, and that will be the last example that we'll do here. So let's talk about doing reports from scratch, which is where the concept of source destination really comes into play. So I'm going to start with the most common issue that people have, which, let's say, for example, they want to see all the checks that they paid from a specific bank account. So most people, what they would do for that is they would go into reports, they would go into balance sheet, okay? And then they would click on the specific bank account where those checks will originate from. Click on that. And then you would see all of the transactions. And then they would go to customize report. And so far, so good, right? They go to filter. And then we have the account. In this case, in this particular report, is showing Chase as a distribution account. But really what they mean is source account. And then we're going to put transaction type. Let's say, where is my transaction type? And let's just put check. There we go. And then click on run report. So then this report would essentially just give me all the checks that were written from that Chase account. And this is where people get confused, which is they're looking at the split line, or what we're calling the distribution line. And then some of these say the word split. The reason for that, and I'm going to click on that transaction, is because this specific transaction has more than one line. So anytime that one transaction has more than one line, you're going to see that issue. You're going to see the word split. And the reason for that, and again, the reason for that is because when you created this report in its nature was a source account report, because you started from the balance sheet. And there's no button you can press on this report to make the multiple lines of this check 508 to show up in here. So if you wanted to see the details on an account, you have to create a detailed report from scratch. So you go into search and you type transaction detail by account report. You have to start with a transaction detail by account report, and you have to switch this over to none, and then click on run report. So this essentially will start as a detail account. So this will start with detail, not with source. Okay, and then I'm going to go into, let's do all dates here. And then I'm going to go into customize. And then I'm going to click on filter. And then I'm going to go to transaction type. Same thing we did before. And did check. And then click on run report. So now you will notice that, let me just do customize report. And let's take away the distribution account and click on run. So you will notice that okay, they're telling me here that we're running out of time for our sponsor. So sorry about that, guys. We'll go ahead and put a pause to that. I'll know exactly where we stood off. Download the slides. There's a couple of extra resources. There's a couple of links there you can watch to watch more details on reports. And there's my email for any open Q&A. Let me go ahead and transition to the last couple of minutes we have for our sponsor, ADP. So sorry, usually happens when you go when you get excited about a topic. So ADP, first of all, thank you very much for sponsoring this episode. I'm going to transfer over to Nick for a minute so I can do the last couple slides. I want to tell you what I like and what I dig about ADP. Number one, when you're an accountant, you're going to set up a free Accountant Connect account. Okay. The last slide from ADP will have the link to that. Once you have the Accountant Connect account, you can add all your clients in a single login. One thing I really, really like is I can, across multiple clients, essentially pull the same report. So I can, let's say I want to run a payroll detail report for the whole year of last year for 7 clients. You can batch them all in one shot. That's been really, really useful during tax time. The other great thing about the new Accountant Connect is the new improved QuickBooks Online GL mode, where you can map the different expense categories and liability categories to your QuickBooks Online to have that integration so you don't have to manually enter payroll information into QuickBooks Online. The additional accountant resources are excellent. COVID-19 resources, PPP knowledge base, they're really, really up to date. And of course, the CCH tax library, it's amazing. It includes all the tax reform information, all the CARES Act information. And because it's very relevant to accountants, PPP forgiveness reports. I think ADP is sort of leading the way with PPP forgiveness reports. Just give it a shot. Any of your clients that have payroll, try those PPP forgiveness reports. They're going to save you hours and hours. So thank you very much, ADP, for sponsoring us. I'm going to go ahead and move it up to Nick from ADP so he can do his quick spiel here. And then we'll run a quick polling question, and then we'll go ahead and end it.